Okay, the time in the project where I have dreaded is gluing legs together. I printed everything for this droid first, and then I'm starting to glue things together. That was maybe not the smartest idea. Problem I'm having is the fitment of parts together, especially these legs. These are supposed to be made really strong because they take the weight of the droid. And the problem I'm having is things didn't print perfectly level, and so were these glued together. I got the dovetails to fit, took a little bit of filing, not too much. I had a little bit of elephant's foot down here. I've talked about that before, where your nozzle is starting a bit too close to the bed. And so instead of that being flat, it prints this direction. It curves outwards because it smushes the first few layers of filament too much. Sanded that flat, and then it turns out, for whatever reason, it seems like not only did I have elephant's foot down here, but the top also kind of looks like it flared out a little, possibly. I don't know why, I don't know how. Both legs, all three pieces. There's another small piece that goes over here. So here's the deal. How do you sand and file every single contact point all the way across here to be perfectly level? I don't know. I've done the best I can do by eye. This piece, if you had like some kind of a belt sander, you might be able to put it down on the table and get it to sand flat everything except the dovetails, which again, that's 1, 2, 3 contact areas that might be warped on, or I don't know if warped is the right word, warped, not the correct shape, whatever, flared out too far in one direction or the other. This piece, of course, you put that on a belt sander, and the only thing it's going to touch are the 2 dovetail joints. It's not going to catch any of this, and this angle, and that angle, and this angle. So I've done the best that I could. The dovetails fit together fairly well. My problem is the gap in here. The gap in here and the fact that these aren't level. So this is a upper part of the leg. This horseshoe eventually goes on top of that. Because of that, you want to have these 2 pieces level on this side. This side faces the droid. It's bolted up against R2. You don't care if that's a little bit off level. But if this is off level, you look at it from the side and you'd see something like that, where that right-hand piece is lower than the left-hand piece. And that's kind of what I got going on. So to make it level, I need to flip it upside down on this level piece of MDF and use 2-part epoxy, right? And glue it like that, so that the part that this rests on, that people see, is as flat as possible. Okay, no problem there, till you get to look at this gap. That's a pretty wide gap. I don't know if that's too wide for structural support. This is supposed to take the weight of the droid. If I have so much epoxy in there, is that going to be a problem? Now, what I can also do, although thinking about it, if I've epoxied it, I could go in with my soldering iron and some more filament, and I could do some filament welding in there. But if I've put a whole bunch of epoxy to try and get the gap filled, deeper down where I can't reach with a soldering iron, is it going to be melting the plastic and the epoxy? And then I'll be laying more PLA plus down in between the two. Is that actually going to work and stick? I'm not quite sure. So yeah, and I can't clamp it because if you look at the gap, if I clamp this piece, I have to clamp it in a way that it doesn't lift up. Because that's my problem, is the right hand side wants to lift up in the air, and if you do that, when you put this horseshoe on eventually, it won't be level across those two pieces. Like you can see, this is the seam between the two pieces. The way this part wants to go is like that, where there's a gap near my thumb and no gap up above. So this piece is like that and not level. And I've done my best trying to file the dovetails to get them to line up. And I spent a couple hours, and then I put it away for a week, and the next week I spent a couple hours, and the next week. So I've spent a good amount of time trying to get those dovetails closer and to get it level. And this is about the best that I've come up with. So I can't find anywhere on Facebook, the Facebook group for Michael Baddeley's Droids, any posts about how big of a gap is too big. Is this okay? I've searched for leg gap and dovetail gap and dovetail joint, and I've searched all kinds of different terms, and just another reason why I'm not fond of Facebook group as a place where you're trying to find information. Is it's just, you're kind of limited to what you can search for. There isn't like a folder called R2D2 and then dome, legs, shoulders, that you can just go right to and find posts and post things related to that. So I could take a picture of this and post it to the Facebook group, which is what I probably should do, and say, hey guys, is that too big of a gap? Or do you think it'll be okay? I think it'll probably be okay, mainly because it's not the only thing holding it together. After that gets glued, you've got these on either side, and those I will clamp. Those I can clamp across, and so between those and this and the epoxy, I think that'll be fine. I don't think it'll be going anywhere. It's just not making me happy. It's just really wanted the thing to go together and have a better contact area, or at least be able to figure out how I can humanly file it. Because right now it looks like I have to take some material off about 3/4 of this joint, which, oh yeah, that's no big deal until you consider it's this joint. It's this joint. It's inside the dovetail, it's outside the dovetail, inside, outside, down at the bottom, inside, outside. I mean, it's crazy by hand to think that you're going to get all that straight. So, at least for me it is. So, yeah, you can see if I lift it up, it looks beautiful. It's great. But if I do that, then when it's right side up, this horseshoe isn't going to fit right, because this part's going to be pointing downwards, so there's going to be a bit of a gap. And then the parts that go in here might also have the same thing going on, where they're a little bit higher at the one end than they are at the other. So, current plan, unless I can think of something else, is just put these upside down, put the epoxy in there, and hope that that's a good enough joint strength-wise after the side pieces are added. And it's the same kind of issue down here. Same kind of slight warping down here. But if I do that, everything, trying to put my fingernail under there, it's a pretty good job of getting that top surface that you're going to see. That's everything that attaches to that side. So that's the side I would want flat. So I think I'm just going to do it, and I'm thinking that those gaps will probably be okay. But just to show that maybe don't do what I did and print everything first, especially with these parts that are a lot of plastic in these parts. There's a print guide that I used that shows most of the parts in the R2D2 Mark III build. Actually, this is the Mark II leg, which only differs from the Mark III leg in that it's split to fit on smaller printers. The guide is for the Mark III, and I used his settings for the legs, so, and everything else. So these are, I cannot remember for sure right now, but I want to say 5 perimeters and 35 or 40% infill. I mean, they are substantial pieces. They used a lot of filament. So if you're making one of these droids, try your dovetails out the first time you print. Maybe print the smaller piece and the lower leg first, because those will use less plastic than printing these two first. And then see how your joins go. And if you have a problem, do some calibration before you print the other leg. Instead of like me, when I got these off the printer, the dovetails did not go together. And I figured, okay, that's standard. You know, a lot of things I print, I have to sand the dovetails a little bit to get them to fit. And I knew I had an elephant's foot issue on that printer where the nozzle's too close to the bed. So I knew that was an issue. But I just put the parts aside and then printed the next part, the next part, the next part, the next part. And not until now am I going through the filing, sanding, and assembly and seeing that, oh yeah, that's kind of maybe something I should have looked in if I had caught it earlier, that I've got a slightly odd warping issue that seems to be where the pieces are, instead of straight up and down, it almost seems like they're doing that, almost like they're dished. So the top and the bottom are both a little bit protruding out more than they should. So, yeah, that's the video for today. Not a lot of progress. I've been sanding for about an hour, or filing, I should say. Filing these pieces on both for about an hour tonight, and these are pretty much from whenever the last time I worked on them. I haven't messed with them any tonight. So I don't think I'll glue it tonight. It's already about 1 a.m. Maybe I'll take a picture and post it to the Facebook group and say, hey guys, you know, do you think that's okay to have a gap about that big once it's all epoxied together? And I'll bet that it's probably okay. That it's probably fine. I'm just being a little bit too much of a perfectionist for something that comes off a 3D printer. So yeah, that's about it for this video. Just showing you what I ran into, and maybe don't be like me and print absolutely everything first and then try putting stuff together. Yeah, I even feel a slight wobble in this direction too. On this piece here. Not too much on the leg. Not really here. But a little bit on that middle piece. Okay. That's it. Wish me luck. Okay, I'm a little more impatient than I am smart. I did not post on the forums about this gap and if that gap is too big and how you go about. I know I need to remove material from the top, at least half of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, plus all the insets for the dovetails. And I went ahead and glued it together. I'm using JB Weld plastic bond. Read on the forums, that's what a lot of people, or several people at least, recommended. It is different than the two-part epoxies I've used in the past. Thought I'd mention that if somebody hasn't used it. It is more viscous, I guess you'd say, more watery. Normally when I mix a two-part epoxy, it's really tends to be really thick, and this stuff surprised me with not being thick at all. It was, I mean, it's not like water, but it was definitely noticeable from all the other plain, clear 5-minute, 15-minute epoxies that I've used before. Normally I just use, what you get at the store that comes in a couple tubes that you mix together. I've never bought the larger quantity epoxies, and maybe they're different, but just store brands like Gorilla Epoxy and things like that, where it's a two-part and it dries clear, is what I've used for years. And the other thing is the smell. I could not smell this stuff. So I am so used to mixing up epoxy and having to do it outside because it smells so bad. This stuff you can do inside. I'm sure there's fumes and you shouldn't probably do it inside unless you have adequate ventilation, but it's not something that you can smell. It doesn't reek your whole house up like epoxy if you were to use it inside. The first piece I glued together, these two, I did out here in our laundry room. And when I realized that this stuff doesn't smell at all, I did the rest of the gluing in my hobby room. So, yeah, a couple takeaways if you've never used the JB Weld plastic bond. I used an entire, it comes in the plastic tube that has the resin and the hardener that you mix together. I used an entire tube for this, and I put more on there than I normally would when I'm gluing something together because I had these gaps. I wanted to try and be able to get as much glue into the gaps to fill the gaps as possible. Now, that's one thing that's also on the package for that product, is that it says it fills gaps. So it's another reason why I think I'm going to be fine with the way these turned out. One thing I did that was kind of dumb, again, impatience tends to get me every now and then. This piece here is the one that had the larger gaps, especially in these flat areas. This one wasn't nearly as bad. This is the one I did first. And when I got done, I noticed I could see those gaps. And I'm like, okay, well, I can weld some filament in to fill those gaps. But getting a soldering iron in there to melt the filament looks like it's going to be kind of a pain in the neck. This one, those may be going in this way, but still it's going to be, it's not going to be fun. So what I decided to do, because this stuff is more viscous, I figured if I put extra on here, it's going to work its way down into the crack, down into the open space, and fill it. Great idea. So I did that. When did I do that? Same time I mixed the epoxy up to glue the legs on. So here's the order I did it. I did these two pieces to begin with, got them done, kind of grabbed both ends, tried to flex it, made sure it wasn't like super weak. It seemed to be plenty strong. I think it's going to be okay. So then I glued these two pieces together. The gaps inside aren't nearly as big, and this is as it came out. That's not with me adding any extra glue. It just happened to push glue out in those areas so that that gap is pretty much filled. This one did not come out like that. It had the bigger gaps there, whether it was the way I put it together, the fact the gaps were bigger, used more epoxy on this one. I don't know why, but this one had larger gaps that I knew I was going to have to do something with there. So then after I had those both glued up to that point, I mixed the rest of the epoxy to do the lower legs. And that is when I decided, well, let me put that epoxy in here. Just took a screwdriver and got the epoxy on it and put it down in there. And it should flow down into the space between the parts. Great idea, but what I didn't think of is I did that and let it sit there, and then this one I put the epoxy on both sides of this, and I put the epoxy on both sides of this, and then I put these two pieces together, and because I need it to be level, I flipped it upside down and put 12 pack of soda to weigh it down. And the same thing with this one, and so now you can see the problem. Now it's upside down, and I wanted that to flow down. Well, now it's going to flow away and not into the crack, so that was stupid. I could have used my finger with a glove or paper towel and mushed it down in there to make sure it got in there, and then put some blue tape over it, and that would have kept the vast majority of it down in there. So right now I have no idea how much got in the crack and how much came back out. I will say that it looks about the same now as it did when I put it on there, so I don't think, yeah, I still think some got in there, some definitely got in there, and it's definitely got glue across the crack, so I'm going to leave it like that. I'm not going to chip this stuff off and try and redo that or weld it. I think it's good. Pretty sure that's going to be strong enough. Like I said, this one didn't have quite as large a gap, and for whatever reason, the way I put the two parts together, maybe it's because this one I wiggled them a little more as I was putting them together, because the whole part of dovetail joints is you want them to be tight. Well, if they're really tight, they just push all the glue out that you put in them. So that's why I used a whole tube just to glue these 4 joints. I put a lot of glue on both sides, and I tried to kind of wiggle the pieces together as I went, trying to keep as much glue in the joints as possible. So maybe this one, because it didn't have as big a gap to start with, and the way I wiggled it or something, maybe that ended up with the glue coming out here, so it definitely doesn't have the issue that this one had with a space there that I wanted to fill. I'm not exactly sure, but it should be fine. I believe that should be fine. If that fails, then I don't think it's because my gap was too big. I think it'll probably be because maybe that glue doesn't like this plastic or something. I think that's going to be okay. This, I can see that I have still a little bit of gap on the back sides of these. And my fingernail goes in there a bit, so I'm not sure if I want to buy some more of that glue or try and do the plastic welding. My concern with plastic welding is that there's glue residue on that, and even if which I will, I'll sand the top before I do anything, but once I sand this glue residue off the top, there's still some in between the pieces, so I'm going to run a hot soldering iron down there, which will, I don't know what that's going to do to the glue, if that's going to melt it, burn it, or what, but it's going to contaminate the plastic so that when I go back with more PLA plus filament, it's not going to be PLA plus filament bonding to PLA plus and PLA plus. There's going to be that unknown of the epoxy in there. So, not sure what the best way is to deal with that. Same thing here, although this gap is really small. Filler is probably fine for this gap. In fact, filler might be fine for this gap. Although I think I'd rather do epoxy because, well, I'll have more epoxy because I need to glue the side pieces on. There's 4 side pieces for each of these that further hold them together, so I'll have the epoxy on hand, so I'll probably just overfill that with epoxy in this direction so I can get down in there before it dries and then sand the excess off. So the important thing though was that I put these upside down with 12 packs of soda on them, trying to get them as flat as possible on this face, because this is where the horseshoe goes. This is facing out from the droid. This is the part you see. So I wanted the things that mount to this to have as flat a surface as possible. So one way to see how that went is to put these two together face to face and look at the gap. And I got no gap, no gap. I have a little bit of a gap there. Down here where those two glue. I mean, just maybe a little tiny gap there. Turn them over. Okay, little gap there. And again, small gap there. Now, when I first did that, I thought, okay, I can probably fix that with filler, body filler. That's not going to be a problem. And then I realized that, hang on a sec, there's a cover that goes over this. There's a piece that goes over this that helps glue these two parts together. So this whole thing is going to be epoxied and covered by a cover piece. That cover piece is what you're going to see, not this. So even though this might have a little dip in it right here, the cover piece goes over the top and it's level, right? It's got straight edges top and bottom. So this will be inside. You won't even see it. You'll just see that cover piece. Horseshoe goes on top, cover piece goes over here. So if that piece that goes on top covers that, and I can line it up right, it'll cover that up. And even if it doesn't, but a little bit of body filler will take care of that, because this rounded edge continues onto this cover piece, so that definitely needs to have some filler. These curves need to have some filler to get them nice and smooth and round, and so I think it's going to be absolutely fine. I think that the worrying about it having some small gaps is not a big deal, and once those side pieces are on, the horseshoes will probably go on perfectly flat and everything will be fine. And these legs feel nice. I put a piece of paper down on this board, glued things in this direction, and then put blue tape over the seam, and then the soda on top for the weight. So I've scraped off the paper residue because the glue had come out of the joints and stuck to the paper, which is what I wanted instead of having them stuck to the board. And it feels really nice there. Those joints seem pretty darn flush. Just these outside edges just seem a little bit, like I said, where you can see that gap. This piece right here might get a little bit low before it joins up with this, just a hair. So I think these are a success. I think the amount of gap in it is probably just perfectly acceptable for 3D printed parts, and that finishing is going to take care of that, and they should look just fine. So that's a major worry of mine, major stress point was, what am I going to do? I can't get these to fit perfectly together, and I think I was just overthinking it. I mean, it would be nice if my printer wasn't seemingly printing things a little bit bowed out for the final part of the print. Or, you know, I could have done that myself too, because when you print things out, when the print head goes around corners, it tends to leave a little extra material. I could have sanded that, or filed. I was using files. I could have filed that down uneven. So I filed more of it at the bottom than the top. There's various reasons why that could have happened, where the top seems to have more material than the bottom. Print bed not being level, etc. But yeah, I've gone from I'm worried these aren't good enough to these should be absolutely fine. These should look great once they're all finished and sanded and primered and sanded and sanded and primered and filled and filled and sanded and filled and primered and then eventually painted. So it's good news. It's been kind of bugging me and slowed progress on the project, because I thought, you know, these are really important parts to be strong, and they're going to be visible, and really wanted to turn out nicer than I thought they would, but now I think they'll be just fine. So that's it for this week.